Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida. This is the second part of Florida's fascinating forts. The good news is that it doesn't matter if you haven't seen part 1. This part covers completely different fortifications. I'm going to replay the introduction I did in the first video, so here we go. Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another amazing Florida 10. I'm here today at Fort DeSoto because it's one of the most interesting fortifications in the state. It's located at the mouth of Tampa Bay. It was constructed between 1898 and 1906 in response to the Spanish-American War. That conflict lasted only 4 months, and by the time it was over, only the foundations of this fort had been created. Over the past 458 years, Europeans and later Americans would build dozens of forts all throughout Florida, although only about 10 would be more than temporary. Today I'll take a look at those built by the French and the Spanish, as well as those created during the Seminole Wars, America's most expensive and longest-lasting Indian wars. So join me as I look at fortified Florida. Enjoy! Amazing Florida Fort Number 6, Cooper and an early instance of psychological warfare. What would become Fort Cooper was created in 1836 in the midst of the Second Seminole War. The war began the year before, ostensibly because many Seminoles who had decades before fled from Georgia into Spanish Florida refused to be forced into exile in the Indian Territory, later to become Oklahoma. The same Georgia settlers who had pushed the indigenous communities into the undeveloped Spanish territory were now moving into the peninsula that had recently become part of the United States. Prior to the war, the U.S. had moved nearly 4,000 Florida Seminoles, including associated blacks who were formerly enslaved, halfway across the country through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. At the start of the war, most of the Seminoles who remained in Florida retreated south to hide in the wetlands and forests of the southern half of the peninsula. Some, however, would look for ways to cause the U.S. Army problems. Unlike many of the forts that were built during the Second Seminole War, which were built by large companies of the military and could withstand any Seminole attack, this fort was created differently. In 1836, Major General Winfield Scott began a campaign to attack the Seminoles with an army of 5,000. At one point, Scott and his army marched southward towards Fort Brooke in Tampa in pursuit of a band of Seminoles. Stopping at Lake Lolath-Likaha, near present-day Inverness, Scott decided to have the sick and wounded stay in the wilderness. This much smaller and weaker force was commanded by Major Mark Anthony Cooper. Considering the exposed nature of the temporary encampment, Cooper realized that a large Seminole force might be able to decimate the company. The military built a rough fortification on the shore of the lake. It was little more than a stockade, a defensible series of palisades within which tents were placed. A few days after Scott departed, a force of several hundred Seminole warriors, led by the Seminole leader Osceola, attacked. While the 380 soldiers remained safe in the stockade, the Seminoles chose to lay siege, figuring the small force was vulnerable and undersupplied. The siege ran for 16 days, with the Seminoles raiding the fort multiple times and capturing the cattle the army had left. The Seminoles were right. The fort's supplies were running low, but with the newly collected army cattle, the attacking forces were well supplied. In fact, the Seminoles would barbecue the cattle, out of rifle range, but well within the fort's inhabitants' ability to smell the roasting meat. Contemporary reports suggested it was done intentionally, which could mean that it was an early example of psychological warfare. General Scott and his troops finally arrived to rescue the soldiers, and the Seminoles, yet again faced with superior numbers, simply left the area. While the attack could be considered one of the longest fights in the Second Seminole War, it resulted in no casualties except for the barbecued Florida scrub cattle. Amazing Florida Fort Number 7, Christmas, a replica that's outlasted the original by 45 years. Located east of Orlando near the St. Johns River, Fort Christmas represents the more than 200 forts built during the Second Seminole War, which lasted between 1835 and 1842. The replica was built in 1976 and 77 by Orange County Parks. While it took the 20th century builders about a year to complete the replica, the original took a little over a week, though the military force included some 2,000 troops and 1,000 horses. Construction of the fort, which was located about a mile or 1.5 kilometers north of the current one, began on Christmas Day, 1837. It was a part of a series of forts constructed by both the U.S. Army and Alabama militia under the command of Brigadier General Abraham Eustis. Eustis led his troops south from Fort Mellon to Day Sanford, building a road, numerous bridges, and a number of forts, each about a day's march from each other. The goal, laid out by Major General Thomas Jessup, was to drive renegade Seminoles and the escaped slaves that lived with them into a pincer movement so they would be subdued and forcibly removed to the Indian Territory. The plan failed. Fort Christmas was staffed by troops for about a year until 1838, when it was abandoned, as were most of the forts in Central Florida. None of the nearby forts ever saw any battles, and were really staging and supply depots for the army, which had trouble finding anyone to fight. The replica fort is the centerpiece of the Fort Christmas Historical Park, which includes recreation facilities and a collection of early buildings, including cracker homes. It's one of the larger collections of early Florida buildings in the state. Both the fort, which is still in excellent condition and has a small museum, and the cracker buildings are well worth a visit. Like many of the forts in this video, there are regular annual events where volunteers recreate what life was like when the forts were active. Amazing Florida Fort Number 8, CLINCH, where the Confederate forces fled soon as the U.S. Navy arrived. Located on Amelia Island at the mouth of the St. Mary's River, Fort CLINCH is an impressive and imposing site, probably the most imposing of any fortification on this list. That being said, CLINCH was never completed by the U.S. Army, and it never saw military action. The location was originally fortified by the Spanish around 1736, but Spain's interest in Florida never really grew past the settlements in St. Augustine and Pensacola. Fast forward to Florida as a U.S. territory, and we see the federal government purchasing the land in 1842. The area was generally a lawless zone with a lot of pirate and smuggling activity. The U.S. wanted control of the area, especially since the port of Fernandina on the St. Mary's River was developing into an important one. In 1847, construction of the massive fort was begun. The structure is pentagonal in shape, with both inner and outer walls. There are corner bastions and embrasures in the outer walls. It's made up of nearly 5 million bricks and is one of the larger forts in the state. The fort would be named after General Duncan Lamont Clinch, one of the generals involved in the First Seminole War. The fort was considered a low priority, and construction progressed slowly, so that by the time that Abraham Lincoln was elected president, only 2 bastions and about 1/3 of the outer wall were finished. Some outer walls were hastily erected, but by the time Florida seceded from the Union, the fort lay unfinished, without armament, and abandoned. The local Florida militia occupied the fort in early 1861 and set up an encampment with small cannon and other basic artillery. Their goal was to protect the fort of Fernandina as well as the town of St. Mary's in Georgia. At the end of 1861, some 1,500 troops were stationed at CLINCH, representing both the Florida militia and Confederate Army. While the government in Tallahassee was fully committed to the war, the state and the military would struggle to maintain control of Florida's defenses and coastal towns. Fort CLINCH was an excellent example. In March 1862, the U.S. Navy sent gunboats to engage the Confederates. The Union gunboats were quickly converted steamboats, originally designed for passengers. Against a proper fort, they would have caused little worry, but the Confederates knew that the unfinished and partly improvised fortification was vulnerable and chose to evacuate. There were pro-Union residents of Fernandina who were able to get word to the captain of the gunboat Ottawa, a Lieutenant Commander Stevens. They provided him with the information that the retreating troops had boarded a train to evacuate. The Ottawa was able to trail the train along the shallow river. The Confederates fired their guns at the gunboat while it attempted to disable the train's 2 steam engines. The Ottawa was able to kill several of the men on the train, though the Confederates were able to make their escape. One of the men on the train that was able to escape was David Levy Yulee, a politician and railroad financier who was heavily invested in the Confederate cause. When Florida seceded from the Union, Yulee resigned as one of its U.S. senators. After the war, he was imprisoned at Fort Pulaski for 9 months for having aided the escape of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Yulee would go on to provide his name for the city of Yulee, 9 miles west of Fernandina, as well as Levy County on the Gulf Coast of the state. Fort CLINCH became the first of the Confederate-held forts in Florida to be returned to the U.S. possession, and troops from the 1st New York Volunteer Engineers were brought in to work towards the fort's completion. The Union held the fort for the rest of the conflict, and while work continued on it, advancements made in gun technology during the war soon rendered such forts obsolete. In 1867, only 2 years after the war, the fort was put on the inactive list and all construction stopped. The fort was reactivated for the Spanish-American War and World War I, and in 1935, Florida purchased the land on the northern tip of Amelia Island, including the fort. During the Great Depression, the Federal Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, helped to develop it as one of Florida's first state parks. Amazing Florida Fort No. 9, CHOKONIKLA, first of a chain of forts that began to drive Seminoles into the Everglades. Nothing remains of Fort CHOKONIKLA, a fort built between the Second and Third Seminole Wars near the present-day city of Bowling Green. Prior to the fort came a trading post, the Kennedy Darling Store. It was established on the Charlo-Papcahatchee Creek, which translates from the Seminole language as Little Trout Eating Creek. This was at the edge of a rather vaguely defined Indian reservation, the place where Seminoles who had not been forcibly moved to Oklahoma retreated at the end of the Second Seminole War. White Americans began settling near the area, and the trading post was soon destroyed by Seminoles, killing the traders. The Army reacted by establishing a series of forts along a line from Fort Hamer near present-day Bradenton to Fort Pierce, and south all the way to Fort Dallas, near what would become Miami. Fort CHOKONIKLA was the first of the 16 new forts built, located only about a half-mile from the site of the trading post. The chain of forts was designed to protect settlers in areas to the north and to try to get more Seminoles to move to Oklahoma. While they were offered bribes, few agreed to move, and the forts proved fairly useless. Some were occupied for a few years, but CHOKONIKLA was abandoned in less than a year. The area was too wild and filled with malaria-carrying mosquitoes. In fact, malaria was one of the largest killers of Army personnel in Florida. Like most of these hastily built forts, nothing remains of CHOKONIKLA. The ground it sat on today is part of Paynes Creek State Park. The Little Trout Eating Creek was renamed for one of the traders killed in the Seminole Raid, George Payne. Oddly enough, while most of the Seminole War forts were either named after military individuals or occasionally something like Fort Christmas, Fort CHOKONIKLA reportedly comes from the Seminole term chokanikler, meaning burnt store. Amazing Florida Fort No. 10, DeSoto. The only action it saw was as a bombing range. The Spanish-American War, the shortest international war in which the U.S. ever fought, was the country's entry into colonialism. Fought over 115 days in the summer of 1898, the U.S. would gain ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain. Some 2,400 Americans died in the conflict, but 80% of them died of diseases such as typhoid and yellow fever, often in the overcrowded military camps located in the U.S. while waiting to go to war. As I mentioned in the introduction, Fort DeSoto's foundations were laid during that short conflict. Fort DeSoto, named after the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, was built on Mullet Key, one of the out islands at the mouth of Tampa Bay. The arrowhead-shaped island and its neighbor, Egmont Key, were recommended for fortifications prior to the Civil War, and both would have Union soldiers garrisoned on them during the war to aid in the coastal blockade of Confederate Florida. During the Spanish-American War, Tampa served as a main embarkation point for the troops headed to Cuba, and the two keys served as the departure and quarantine facilities, but the main construction of heavy mortar batteries would not be completed until 1906. They were never fired in battle, and while the Army post connected with the gun batteries included 29 buildings, it was never heavily staffed, even during World War I. In 1923, Fort DeSoto was abandoned, and subsequent hurricanes destroyed most of the post with the exception of the massive concrete batteries. Between 1938 and 40, Pinellas County owned the property, but the War Department repurchased it when it appeared that World War II was coming. At that point, Mullet Key and its fort were attached to Tampa's MacDill Airfield to be used as a target range. MacDill had been created in 1939 and was tasked with the training of bombardment units under the 3rd Bomber Command. During the war, regular patrols flew over and around Fort DeSoto, while fighter pilots regularly strafed the island, and bombers dropped their dummy and live bombs. Its proximity to St. Petersburg and the St. Pete area beaches meant that it was common for locals to hear the explosions. At least one remarked that if a German submarine attacked the bay, they wouldn't have noticed. After the war, Pinellas County purchased the property yet again. Until 1962, there was no vehicle access to the key, but with the completion of a bridge and causeway, a new park was born. The facility was officially dedicated in 1963 with Miss Florida, Guy Lombardo and his band, Henry Fonda, and Dick Pope, the owner of Cypress Gardens, in attendance. Today, the park includes the ruins of Fort DeSoto, miles of beautiful beaches, areas for fishing, a campground, and regular ferries to Egmont and Shell Keys, which are both protected preserves. Thank you for watching another of my videos. Please leave me a comment about the fort you find the most interesting. I'd like to see what you think. Thank you for watching another one of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.